Sorry, sir, we don't serve people like you. That's what the cashier said, loud enough for the whole cafe to hear. Richard, 71, stood frozen. Vietnam vet hat on his head, jacket lined with patches, hands steady, eyes tired. People glanced. Some smirked. But 20 minutes later, when 6 men walked in wearing full-dress uniforms and saluted him silently, the entire room forgot how to breathe. If this hits you hard, comment respect to honor those who served. Richard, 71, is a retired Army sergeant who served 2 tours in Vietnam and lost his younger brother in the war. Now living alone on a small pension, he kept to himself. Mornings meant walks, folded flags, and old habits, like grabbing coffee at the corner cafe where the morning light filters through the windows just right. That morning, he wore his old Army jacket, the fabric worn but meticulously maintained. His boots were polished out of habit, not for anyone's approval, but because some disciplines never leave you. His weathered hat, stitched with a Purple Heart pin, sat atop silver hair that had once been military short brown. As he stepped inside the cafe, holding the door for a young mother and her child, he offered a quiet smile. The little boy pointed at his medals, but the mother pulled him along quickly. The cafe was busy with the morning rush. College students tapped on laptops. Business people scrolled through phones. The aroma of fresh coffee and pastries filled the air. Richard waited in line patiently. A few glances came his way, confused, disapproving. A couple in matching yoga outfits whispered as they looked in his direction, not bothering to lower their voices. "Probably homeless," the woman said. The man nodded. "They're everywhere now." When he finally reached the counter, the teenage cashier scanned him from boots to hat, her expression shifting from boredom to something colder. "Sorry, sir, we don't serve people like you," she said loudly, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet cafe. Richard blinked, momentarily confused. "Like me?" "Drifters, old guys coming in to loiter," she said flatly, looking past him to the next customer. "There's a shelter 3 blocks down." A few customers chuckled. One whispered, "Maybe he thinks that hat earns him a discount." Richard stood tall, shoulders square, the same posture that had carried him through jungles and firefights. "I serve this country. I buried my brother under that flag." The manager, a man in his 30s with an expensive haircut, came over and waved him off. "Please just leave. We're running a business here, not a history museum. You're making the other customers uncomfortable." Humiliated, Richard backed away. No one said a word. No one offered a seat. No one said, "Thank you for your service." His hands, steady even under enemy fire, now trembled slightly as he turned toward the door. Behind him, conversations resumed. Coffees were ordered. Life continued as though nothing had happened, as though he were invisible. Outside, Richard sat on a cold bench facing the cafe. He didn't cry. He hadn't cried since 1971, when he'd watched them lower his brother's flag-draped coffin into the ground. But something in his chest felt heavier than his rucksack ever did during those long marches through Vietnamese highlands. The morning sunlight did nothing to warm him. He stared at his reflection in a puddle near his polished boots. When had he become someone who could be dismissed so easily? When had his service become something to mock rather than honor? A child peeked through the cafe window and waved curiously. His mother noticed and quickly pulled him back, drawing the blinds as though Richard were something dangerous. 2 teenagers walked by, backpacks slung over shoulders. "Bet he's just wearing that for attention," one muttered to the other. "My dad says half those guys just buy the gear at Army surplus stores." The words stung more than Richard would admit. His fingers, calloused and arthritic now, traced the outline of his patch. 173rd Airborne Brigade, the Sky Soldiers. Of his original platoon, only 4 had come home standing. Richard stared at the ground, one hand unconsciously clutching the medal inside his jacket pocket. The one he'd been awarded after the ambush that took 8 men from his unit. The medal he kept close because it belonged more to them than to him. But someone had been watching. A young man in the cafe, barely older than Richard had been when he'd enlisted, had filmed the exchange and posted it online with trembling hands. Caption: "They kicked out a vet for wearing his jacket. Middleton Cafe on 4th Street. This isn't right." The post spread like wildfire through veteran forums and groups. Within minutes, comments poured in. Where is this? I'm on my way. No one disrespects a soldier on my watch. Tag your unit. Let's move. This stops today. Richard didn't know. He just sat there, silent, watching people walk by, some avoiding eye contact, others staring too long, a few offering tight, uncomfortable smiles. He contemplated going home, back to the quiet apartment with faded photographs and folded flags, back to the silence and the memories. It would be easier than sitting here, exposed. 20 minutes later, a black car pulled up across the street, then another, then another. Men emerged, different ages, different builds, different walks of life now. But they moved with the same purpose, the same discipline. Richard noticed them from the corner of his eye, but didn't look up. Not until he heard the sound of dress shoes on pavement, moving in unison. The bell above the cafe door rang. 6 times in rapid succession. 6 men stepped in, different ages, different branches, all in full dress uniform. One by one, they walked up to the counter. The lead officer, chest decorated with ribbons and medals, placed both hands on the counter and leaned forward. We're with Sergeant Richard Clark, and we'll all be having coffee. Now, if you've ever seen someone ignored for their service, comment on Mayor. Fair, this has to change. The cafe went dead quiet. Spoons stopped clinking against cups. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Every head turned toward the counter, where 6 uniformed men stood at attention. The manager turned pale, his confident demeanor crumbling. Is this some kind of prank? One of the men, a former colonel with silver hair at his temples, stepped forward. No, sir, this is loyalty, something you might not recognize. The cashier looked away, suddenly finding the floor fascinating. I didn't know he was really a vet, she mumbled. We get people in costumes sometimes. You didn't ask, the youngest veteran said, his voice quiet but carrying through the silence. His face bore a fresh scar that ran from temple to jaw. You just judged. The ribbons on his jacket? Each one means something. Each one was earned. Outside, Richard had stood up, uncertain what was happening inside. Another officer, a woman with captain's bars, opened the door and saluted him. Sergeant Clark, your table is waiting, sir. Richard was escorted inside. The soldiers formed a line as he entered, and each saluted crisply as he passed. His back straightened instinctively, muscle memory from decades past. Customers stood up. Some took off their hats. Others lowered their phones in respect. The teenager who had filmed the incident nodded silently, eyes wet with emotion. Richard tried to speak, but his voice cracked. Emotions he'd buried for decades threatened to surface. I thought I was forgotten. The colonel stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. We forget nothing, Sergeant, and we leave no one behind, not then, not now. One soldier paid for everyone's drinks. Another set a framed print on the wall, reserved for Sergeant Richard Clark and all who served. The manager approached, his earlier arrogance replaced with shame. Sir, we made a terrible mistake. Your money's no good here. Error. Richard looked at him steadily. It's not about free coffee. News crews arrived within the hour. The video hit 1 million views overnight. The cafe's social media pages flooded with comments, some calling for boycotts, others demanding the cashier's termination. The cafe released a public apology. The manager resigned the following day. The company announced mandatory sensitivity training for all employees. But Richard didn't ask for revenge. When interviewed on the local news station, cameras capturing the new veterans table being installed, he only asked one thing. Promise me, the next vet who walks in, with his scars visible or hidden, won't need a crowd behind him to be treated like a person who gave everything for strangers. The colonel nodded. That's why we're here, Rich. Not just for you, for all of them, for all of us. The company CEO flew in personally to meet Richard. With cameras rolling, he announced a nationwide initiative. Every location would now have a veterans table, always reserved, always respected. It shouldn't take a viral video to remind us who built this country, the CEO said, looking directly at Richard. I'm sorry it took this to make us remember. As they sat drinking coffee together, Richard finally shared stories he'd kept locked away for 50 years, and for the first time since returning home, he felt truly seen. A week later, the cafe unveiled a new section, the Veterans Table. Always reserved, always respected. A small American flag stood on the table, alongside a sign that read, "For those who served, your coffee is waiting." Richard now visits once a week. Same seat, same coffee, never alone. Other veterans join him, sharing stories across generations of service, from Vietnam to Afghanistan. Students come to listen, notepads in hand, learning history from those who lived it. Strangers come to thank him, sometimes wordlessly, sometimes with tears. And the young barista? She now volunteers at the local Veterans Center every weekend, learning names and stories. On the wall beside the flag, in the framed photo of Richard's unit, is a single quote. "Service doesn't end when the uniform comes off, neither should the respect." The cafe became a model for others. Within months, veterans' tables appeared in diners and restaurants across the country, not as charity, but as recognition. Richard never expected applause. He never sought recognition. He just wanted peace, the peace of being acknowledged, of belonging. Now, when he walks down the street in his weathered hat and patched jacket, people nod. Children ask questions, and he answers, keeping alive the memory of those who never came home to tell their stories. Subscribe to Steel Heart Stories if you believe some uniforms deserve more than silence. Steel Heart Stories, because some heroes never stop serving.